if we think about how we were activists before we lived online, there was no requirement, no capacity to be an activist on all issues at one time, nor was there a sense that if you weren't working on everything at one time, you were somehow a lesser person, you were somehow less committed to social justice or to activism. So I think part of it is about the kind of panopticon, the the notion of surveillance of activism as performance, of the kind of politics of gesture that is intrinsic in the form that
Sure.
much of our seeming activism takes. And it's a bind. It's there's a double thing going on, right? So one can both seem to be more engaged than one actually is because of social media and because of what's visible. And then one can also be assumed to be less involved and engaged, to be engaged in ways that are not seen and not known to others on Sudan, on the Congo, um, simply because one is posting about Palestine.
Welcome, Sisonke, to the Radical Futures podcast. It's such a pleasure to have you. I followed you for so long and follow everything you do. I'm such a huge fan.
Thank you, and likewise, Bhakti. It's great to see you again. The last time I saw you was in Cape Town.
Yeah, absolutely. It's nice to meet online, at least.
Yes.
So you're a writer, but a writer who always centers political activism, political engagement, and everything that you write, which is why you're such an important person to talk to in the very bizarre moment we find ourselves in. You are the author of the powerful book Always Another Country, a memoir of exile and home. And here you told your own story about moving across countries and continents with your activist freedom fighter father, with your very empowered, amazing mother. And your second book is The Resurrection of Winnie Mandela, evidence again of the way in which you always center Black women and, of course, South African politics. And today I want to talk, of course, about the gnawing, painful topic, which is Palestine and everything that has come apart, but also perhaps some things have come together as the genocide rages on. South Africa, of course, has put up a bulwark of resistance, and we should unpack that a little bit. Where we are today with that. It's been a while. It just goes on and on. And I also want to sort of focus on the topic of Black and African solidarities broadly. I'm just going to make you like the mouthpiece for all of Africa, the entire continent, and to check where we are, where we're headed, and then like a final question later on is because you live in Australia, you're going to have to enlighten us a little bit about what happens down under. So let me start with you. So I think you're very South African in the way you identify and the topics that you talk about, but you're also very global or cosmopolitan, whichever word, very international, and have lived in so many places. And some of this is captured, of course, in your memoir. So I just wanted to start for those that don't, listeners that don't know everything about you. How do you sort of describe yourself and the worlds that you inhabit?
Great question. I think that's changing a little bit. So
Hmm.
I'm a South African writer. Lived in Australia for almost a decade now. Before that, had been home living in South Africa for 20 years. So since the dawn of democracy. And before that, grew up in exile. So very much a child of the freedom struggle to,
Hmm.
as he said in your introduction, a father who was a member of Umkhonto we Sizwe, which was the military wing of the African National Congress, and so had lived in various African countries. So I think that my primary identity in terms of a lived experience is of one of being an African, no identifier, despite the fact that Africa is not a country. I experience myself, I feel myself to be African, having lived in Kenya, having lived in Zambia, having lived in South Africa, but also kind of with a friendship networks that's very diaspora focused,
Mm.
well, in the US. So yeah, so that's how I would, those are the worlds I inhabit, certainly intellectually still. And then I've lived in Australia for the last decade. And so that's brought with it a kind of new identity for the first time, really living in and settled in the diaspora. Like I'm an African living in the diaspora, which yeah, which is interesting. So those are the worlds I inhabit. I write, and then everything else I do is kind of on the edges so that I can make money to subsidize my writing.
Sure, sure, absolutely. I think before you were identifying yourself as a writer, as doing that as your vocation, I think you kind of belonged in the worlds of development and human rights and things like that. Am I
Yeah.
right? And why did you sort of make a leap? Why were you drawn to writing then?
Yeah. So, firstly, I think as the young person, the notion that you could make a life as a writer felt sort of impossible.
Yeah, it's daunting. It's daunting.
And so coming out of university, I did political science. I South Africa was just freedom was on its way. And so when I finished university, it was just after 1994. I finished university in 96, 97, and immediately went home and started working in development. So first I worked for the Australian aid, agency, and then I worked for various human rights organizations. And in many ways, that was because that was the language of the moment. Human rights was the kind of tool and the through which we were going to think about socioeconomic rights. So we had one political freedom as South Africans, as Black South Africans, and the task ahead of us really seemed to be a task of dealing with tackling, socioeconomic inequality. And so human rights just felt like the most natural and logical thing for many people in my generation, to do. And then I think I had a couple of things happened. And one of them was a bit of a loss of faith in what international institutions could do and what it meant to use the language of human rights. And I think that I wouldn't have been able to, and this was more than a decade ago, I guess about 15 years ago, and I wouldn't have been able to articulate that in language at that time. But it was clear that there was a disconnect between the world that was promised in paper on charters and the incredible South African new constitution, which we had fought for and crafted with such care, and then the conduct of the state. And that gap just felt viscerally clear. It felt very clear. And I was drawn to writing because writing could help me to understand that disconnect. It helped me at least to describe it, right? So I think I was grappling with making meaning and making sense out of a moment in which the promise of freedom, the promise of the liberation struggle was beginning to fade, and the reality of what it meant for power to be in the hands of anybody was becoming more clear. And so there was a cynicism that I did not want to succumb to cynicism, and writing helped me to kind of bridge this gap.
Yeah,
In yeah.
yeah. I mean, talking about succumbing to cynicism, though, it's like the thing about human rights discourses, you know, social justice narratives or whatever you want to call these things, it's like either you're a staunch believer or you're out of the game. It's like if you critique, it's
That's
that's not.
right.
And we always valorize the one who are like, I'll take the long hard path towards shaping human rights policy through a status nationalist kind of approach. And we people who believe in international law, people who believe in human rights, and there's a lot of incredible amazing people who do this work, and it's like we can't shake that stuff off. We haven't burned it down, we haven't dismantled it yet. But I do think, and I don't know if you felt that, but then moving to some other side where you may critique it or where you may pose questions to it can kind of put you on the outs, maybe a little bit of it. I don't know if,
Absolutely. No,
yeah.
I completely, yeah. I mean, when I think about when I inhabited that world, it required an absolute and unshakable belief. I
Hmm.
mean, I think, you know, everyone I always worked with was still incredibly critical, but so committed that the criticisms were something that you held. You held it, you understood it, but that didn't mean that you stopped. And then I think that there's a certain level of critique you reach where it
Hmm.
feels disingenuous to continue.
Yeah.
And so I, like you, I deeply respect people who have stayed the course,
Yeah.
who have stuck with it, who continue to engage in those forums, who continue to insist that human rights means something, even as we have watched its disintegration in the last 3 years, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, I want to say something about, on the one hand, like the importance of writing into those critiques,
Hmm.
and on the other hand, the absolute impossibility of believing that writing makes any difference.
I know.
So, um,
I
so
know.
then you're stuck, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think part of the crisis that I end up with in this is because I'm not someone who was ever like a lawyer, or I didn't work in NGOs, or, I wasn't ever, or I'm not a political scientist. So everything I do ends up in this ubiquitous category that we call culture or culture work.
Yeah.
And even though we look around and we know culture is where the war of narrative is won, where the narratives are shaped, where representation is shaped, that advances everything, that shapes everything in the political world, somehow culture gets a sort of a bad rep for being soft, but for being like this soft thing, this cute thing. Oh, writing, how adorable.
Yeah.
Publishing, that's
Yeah.
nice.
Yeah.
Literature, poetry, wow, as if it
It's so
doesn't have
complicated.
political, instrumental political power. So
Yeah.
maybe that's what you're, I don't know, is that what you're trying to sort of articulate?
Yeah.
That's always my problem.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, I think, yeah, it's so complicated because, yeah, and I think, and I keep coming back to this word, which is cynicism, because
Mhm.
I think part of the setup, part of the trap, is to believe that language means nothing, that culture work doesn't take us anywhere,
Yeah.
um, because it doesn't build institutions, it doesn't move the kind of tangible resources that, say, build a clinic or provide, you know, health services, et cetera, et cetera. But you're absolutely right. Culture work is crucial. I mean, like, where are we without James Baldwin? Where are we without, the ideas that in many ways have powered forward the response to this genocide? Um, the kind of political pressure that has been brought to bear, as ineffectual as it may feel, on many days, particularly a day like this one, where yesterday Israel, bombed 50 buildings in Gaza City,
Mhm.
and has bombed Qatar. Like, on a day like this, you feel, powerless.
Mhm.
But I think it serves no one to deny the power of the response that regular people have mounted in the face of this genocide. And that, as you say, Bhakti, that would not be possible without the culture work, you
Without
know?
language, without writing, without
Yeah.
those forms of expression. Yeah, I know. And yeah, it's tough to make it go, because so much of politics is about dismissing that. So I think that's where we end up. against each other rather than with each other or something like that, But I guess we have to just keep at it. I want to talk about uh, Palestine, of course. And like I said, I'm going to turn you into uh, a representative for all of Africa, which is not a role you say you're
No,
shirking.
never.
You're okay with it. I have your consent. So, so I think one of the things I want to say is that we live in this world where there is this constant there's constant a miserly sort of economy of attention, right? So it's like, how dare you just talk about Palestine? Why not Sudan and Congo? And that's been going
Yeah,
on forever. How dare
yeah,
not how dare you, but look at you. You have this
yeah,
selective empathy, you have a
yeah,
selective interest. And part of the thing for someone who straddles both those things, of course I care about Palestine, but I care deeply about everything that happens on the African continent. And yes, openly speaking, I care slightly less about what happens in Ukraine, and that's just how I'm built. But the thing about this kind of pitting causes or problems or crises that are African, and then this Palestine thing, one of the ways in which I have started to think about it is that because all of us are out there in this weird public sphere, like Free Palestine, this, that, and the other, what it has done, it has shone a light on these neglected, so called neglected African issues or African
mhm,
problems. But,
mhm,
and you see sometimes certain activists, like, for example, I follow the actor Saul Williams, who's a
mhm.
really
Yeah.
incredible voice for all these things. And he's now like intensively focused on Sudan stuff, and I just worry sometimes, why can't we hold all these things together? Or is it really necessary for us right now? To me it feels like absolutely vital to focus on Palestine, because it feels like such it feels so daily and hourly and minute by minute. And it also feels like it could stop. If you tried, it could stop right now, tonight. We could have the end to this and we could rebuild. And I don't feel that way about Sudan sometimes. I don't feel that way about Congo sometimes. And maybe that's wrong. I don't know. Where do you lie with all this attention economy, who we are centering, why we are centering whoever we are?
I guess I try very hard to remember and to be rooted in what activism felt and looked like before we lived online.
Mm.
And if we think about how we were activists before we lived online, there was no requirement, no capacity to be an activist on all issues at one time, nor was there a sense that if you weren't working on everything at one time, you were somehow a lesser person, you were somehow less committed to social justice or to activism. So I think part of it is about the kind of panopticon, the the notion of surveillance of activism as performance, of the kind of politics of gesture that is intrinsic in the form that much of our seeming activism takes. So that's one thing. And I think that part of what that does is, and it's a bind, there's a double thing going on, right? So one can both seem to be more engaged than one actually is because of social media and because of what's visible. And then one can also be assumed to be less involved and engaged, to be engaged in ways that are not seen and not known to others on Sudan, on the Congo, um, simply because one is posting about Palestine. So I think it's more. So I think there's something here about gesture perform and performance in politics that's really worth thinking about and dealing with and addressing. On the one hand, on the other hand, and linked to that, If we think about what it meant to be an activist in a time before social media, it did mean um, going to rallies, attending marches. It meant an investment of time in a way that can, in fact, preclude active attendance of everything, right? So if I were to try to find the marches to attend on the Congo, where I am located in Perth, it would be a much more difficult task. My WhatsApp groups are a different thing, the kind of solidarity that you can demonstrate. And of course, when I was with Open Society, we did a lot of work on Congo. So I know that I know the politics of that very, very deeply and very, very well. And I also know its complications given Rwanda, that's a long and complicated story, and that is not to preclude doing activism on it, but it is to say that there is a way of engaging in that looks very different for me than it does to be engaged in Palestine. Um, and of course, like you, I struggle with what it means. Why does Palestine mean what it does to me? And recognizing that what Palestine means to me does come at the expense of a visible engagement around Sudan and Congo. I have resisted um, I have resisted posting and writing about um, Sudan and Congo because I don't want to do something that is gesture. So and because my capacity, I wish I was lying about this, but my emotional capacity to engage any more deeply is really, really limited as on so many levels, as a mother, as a of adolescence, as someone who is deeply engaged around Palestine, is writing about it, thinking about it, crying about it, has personal relationships with people who are from Gaza. Like that is a significant. It's heavy, and I don't want to pretend that I can do that,
And everything else.
especially for things that are so important, right? And Congo is important, and the Sudan is critically important. But I don't want to pretend, and I don't want to do surface, right? So I think it is. It's like super complicated, and it just sucks, basically. But I also have a historical connection to questions of Palestine that I can't deny, and there
What
is
are
a question of affect that I can't deny.
yeah.
Um, so
What
yeah.
are those historical connections?
So I mean the connection as a South African through the African National Congress, Palestine is a conflict that I have um, understood and known kind of in my bones for a very, very long time. I felt really, really bad because I remember when um, my peer and friend Zuki Swawana, she went on the
What's the
trip
matter?
to Gaza, to the West Bank, sorry, right before the genocide started. And I think 2 years before that, I had been invited and hadn't been able to go. And it was something that I had always, really, really wanted to do. And also had thought, I'll do it. I'll do it. So Gaza's been on my mind. Palestine has been on my mind for a very, very long time. And of course, had written about it before the genocide.
Mhm. Is it
Yeah.
just part of the air that progressive South Africans breathe? Because I was talking to an Irish person who says that Irish media is just as shitty as any other media, and they aren't necessarily, they don't come off as pro-Palestine or anything. They're both sidist at most. So then it's like, how come the Irish people are so into Palestine? And then this she friend said it. She's like, it's in their hearts. It's literally
That's it. That's exactly that's such a great way of describing it. And you're right. I think that Palestine is very much in the air that progressive South Africans breathe and have breathed for a very long time.
Mhm.
And you're right. The South African media is pretty horrendous. I mean, we've
Yeah.
seen some pretty bad, interviews. A newscaster who recently questioned Mampela Rampela, a distinguished academic. She had been the vice chancellor of the University of Cape Town in the late '90s, early 2000s. very accomplished, very knowledgeable woman, and she referred to what's happening in Gaza as a Holocaust. And a South African newsreader questioned her and said, "Oh, come on, that's taking things too far. How dare you call it a Holocaust? Right? That's offensive. That's provocative." So this is South Africa's media, and South
Mhm.
Africa's celebrated around the world for taking the case to the ICJ. But yeah, our media is
Yeah.
no better than many other media. But I think for progressive South Africans, the the parallel struggles between our people are too are impossible to ignore. And of course, what's happened to Palestinians is so much worse than anything that ever happened to Black South Africans. So I even, you
Mm.
know, feel guilty about making that comparison sometimes. But for many, many years, I think we saw in ourselves a real kindredness of spirit.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Do you think that now we're entering year 3 of
Yeah.
this genocide? Do you think things have changed in South Africa regarding perception? Is there a kind of forgetting or fatigue? What's your sense of the reporting around it, conversations around it with friends, or however
Look, I live in Australia, and Australia is shocking when it comes to its media reporting and coverage. So until very, very recently, what you did have was a stranglehold of right wing media, and not even an attempt at both sidesism. So there was a report that was done recently that that looked at BBC reporting, on the genocide, and a similar report was done in Australia that had very similar findings around the self censorship that happened at the Australian broadcaster, et cetera, et cetera. So when I compare what it's like in the media in Australia to what it feels like to go home and to have been there, in the last 2, 3 years, and been in shopping centers when the ICG case was going on, and having television screens displaying the case, and the kind of pride of ordinary South Africans that, although it's deeply ineffectual, nowhere near enough that at least South Africa was taking a stand around something that there was a general consensus in the general public made a lot of sense. So the contrast between living in a former white settler colony versus a current white settler colony has been, literally like night and day.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And do you think that I know for a fact that Namibia was impacted by this, and came forward with, of course, they also have the history of genocide.
Against the
And
Herbert. Mhm.
yeah, and so did you feel that it caused a ripple effect that was continental in any way, the International Court of Justice case of genocide against Israel?
No, and I think unfortunately the no is around a little bit of what we were talking about earlier. The extent
Mhm.
to which imperial powers are prepared to burn everything to the ground in service and defense of Israel has been especially stark. So the mask is now off, and there is no question that these institutions were, in a sense, um, yeah, a pretense, a way of pretending at a sense of civilization, right? They were acting as though they were civilized, when in fact, of course, we've always known that they weren't, right? If we're going to use that word against them, I think that this sense that Western, that they acted as if they um, had the sense of values and morals that it is very clear now do not exist. And so, though the idea that one can prosecute genocide in the in international courts, that you can issue warrants through the International Criminal Court, and that those have any meaning, I think their preparedness to rip that to shreds has been um, deeply disheartening. And to speak to the title of this podcast, this idea that a radical future is possible, I think that this is certainly in my adulthood. This is this is the lowest moment for me in a yeah, in a sense of not believe I don't yeah. I don't want to utter the words because I don't want to say
Monumental.
that I don't believe that a more radical future is possible, but
Yeah.
it's hard to find that.
Yeah, yeah. No, no, I know it's we're all very dejected. And I think within that, because, all my sort of scholarly work or writing work has been focused quite a bit on Black and African literature and things like that, I have wanted to see more Black and African solidarities for Palestine. And I think there have been moments like even Ta-Nehisi Coates, when he drew that line, and thank God, or when South Africa and this case, or whatever, Saul Williams, as I was mentioning before. So there's all this stuff, but there isn't this sort of identification that these are our people, they are suffering, and this is colonialism, what we have suffered under, this is apartheid, this is racism at the peak level of it. That's how I feel. But
You know,
I don't know, where
yeah,
can we
you know,
where can we find hope within it? I feel like I want to, or how where are we in this solidarity
well,
question?
I will say, and I think the place where I find the most sense of a radical possibility, surprisingly, given the kind of institutional landscape, is Australia. I think here, what you have seen, what you saw a few weeks ago, was a massive protest
Yeah.
across the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Because, and I think there's a number of reasons why you see Indigenous and Palestinian solidarities being developed here in this place in ways that are both profound and deeply felt, but also very powerfully mobilized. So you saw almost 300,000 people crossing the Sydney Harbour Bridge. You've seen protests every single week. You have a significant Muslim population, high levels of Islamophobia in this country, high levels of anti-Indigenous, anti-Black sentiment in this country, and a real feeling amongst groups at community level of folks who are othered by this settler colony that that we see each other and that we are very much in solidarity. And that solidarity has been building for many years. And when the genocide began to happen, the articulation from the beginning by leaders in First Nations communities working alongside Palestinian leaders has been pretty spectacular to watch. And what you've had in the last year is a really strong kind of upswell of very radical media. So you've got these new podcasts and writing initiatives, Substacks popping up that are both joint and written in solidarity. This is an incredible news source called Deep Cut that's coming out of Sydney that is just remarkable with a bunch of former journalists from The Guardian uh, of Palestinian and Lebanese heritage. So you've got like these very interesting things that are happening, which are speaking back to the way that Australian politics is, so deeply kind of captured by Zionist talking points. And that's very interesting and um, very heartening to watch play out in this context, particularly in this context. I think I think you're right about Tana. I think Ta-Nehisi matters very much because he represents a kind of intelligentsia. He represents a kind of cracking through an elite, a black writer who really reached the upper echelons of liberal, progressive white thinking in the United States. I think though that seeing some, people like Conscious Lee, Saul Williams, those types who have really been able to articulate those links has been interesting. I'm working on a piece at the moment that's around because it's been in my mind for a long time. And this one of the things that has been very, very clear in Israel's conduct since the beginning of the genocide, and in the way that it has been received by the US, in the way that it's been received by Germany, is that the preciousness of white life. So I think we often talk about how Black Lives Matter, but I'm deeply interested in how much white life is prized.
I know.
That that feels like the thing to really,
Yeah.
like, how special can one, you
Yeah.
know, wow.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think within the realm of culture, which it's like I have this cluster of TV shows that become like tremendously popular, and they're all about flawed whiteness and like a precious whiteness, and I'd written some blog or something saying because only white lives matter. And it's really that again and again and again, all we ever consume culturally in the West is just the complex white life, the complex, emotionally wonderful, well-rounded policeman, or the soldier, the vet. And it's all these sort of categories within which the preciousness and fragility, and the deep regard for white life resides. And now we see it all like really like a slap in the face. It's come to haunt us. It's every media narrative. It's every conversation. It's always like, this is what's happening to the hostages, and it's like, yeah, sure, let's talk about what's happening to the hostages. But how can we ignore 20,000 children dead? Why does that not matter at all? And it's really, I would love to. That's great that you're writing that piece. I think it's so much needed. And I want to come back to what you were saying about radical media outlets popping up. I was recently in conversation with our common friend Sean Jacobs about radical media, and we were speaking about this like very interesting moment during like the Arab Springs or the African Springs, whatever you want to call it, where social media became really potent, like a potent vehicle for activism. And it was also the time of blogs popping up everywhere, radical media in some way, Africa's a country, warscapes. We all had our little outlets and things where we were trying to change the game a little bit. And then that moment passed because all the media got bought, like social media algorithms bought your mind, essentially colonized our minds. And you went from like following like 10 different things to just the 8 skincare brands that you care about. It's like that's became the reality. And once again, despite algorithmic intensity, it does seem that we are back in this. There is some rupture, that we're back within there's some sort of juncture we find ourselves in, where once again we are seeing people in Gaza documenting their own suffering, their own deaths, their own torture right
But
there on social
also,
media.
yes, so interesting, like so much that you've just said that I want to respond to. There's a woman I've started following in Gaza in the last few days, just this week. And yesterday she went to the hair salon in Gaza City. So she's fabulous, right? She's just absolutely like stunning. And then in every post she's like showing the rubble, she's showing all this stuff, and then she's like got this like beautiful lipstick on. And then she posts in the morning and she's like, I got such a great response from everybody about how I looked. I decided I'm going to go get my hair done. So I look really great for you guys. And she goes to get her hair done. As she comes out of the salon, there's like the flyers, the pamphlets are falling, and she pans around and you see the pamphlets, and you see in the distance like this kind of one of the towers has just been
Um,
demolished. And it's like surreal. I was talking to a friend of mine, a Palestinian friend of mine yesterday, just texting back and forth, and she was like, I love her so much, and what she does is surrealist. Like she is operating in this zone that's kind of what you were talking about before, about how white life, this idea that if white life is so special, right? Then they're so rounded. They have such depth. And it's like, yeah, me too, actually. Right?
I know. Truly, 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 truly. I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you about gender justice. Like, what in your world, in your networks, are you feeling? There's been this kind of disappointment again, like, oh, we don't care about Palestinian women, or we don't care about mothers, because as you know, it's like how there was some kind of crazy statistic: a mother is killed every 2 hours, or it's just whatever these statistics are, they're just mind-blowing at the end of the day. But we're
Yeah.
talking about motherhood with so many children dying, and so on and so forth. um, and these kind of people upset that feminism has kind of refused to respond, or do you think there's any truth to that, or what
Yeah,
do
of
you,
course.
you feel?
I mean, I long ago abandoned that notion of feminism that says that um, women as a that talks about women as an unraced, ungeographically located, category. Um, and I also long ago realized that the politics of apartheid and occupation will quickly sort of get rid of um those types of feminists who are not interested in true liberation, right?
Yeah.
So nothing about the response to the genocide, or the lack of response, the silence, nothing about it has surprised me at all. um and I Yeah, it definitely feels like this is a moment, as I said before, where the masks have just, like, any pretense, anything that you were still wanting to hold on to, those ideas that really kind of shaped the beginning of my, adulthood, that
Yeah.
notion that sisterhood is global, right? Those are the things that we used to say.
Yeah.
Sisterhood is
No, but
global.
aren't you responding more to like the white feminist failure, which of course we know deep down white feminists have always failed as white Western liberal feminists, right? And any element of that, anything in that direction is always going to lead to it's
Yeah,
not going to it's not going to work for
yeah,
for us.
it
But
never
but
does.
sisterhood is global, or like black feminism, you know, uh,
Okay.
how can we keep
Yeah.
that going?
Yeah, yeah. I have to say, I mean, part of the problem here is that everything has a context. So the genocide is taking place in the context of Trump in America, or Trump in America is taking place in the context of the genocide. I don't know which way you want to put it. And so what that also means is that there is this other, I don't even know how to talk about it, but there's this other thing that's happening with the weariness of Black feminists in the US, right? This narrative about exhaustion and weariness, and in inability or lack of desire to be pulled into anything more than kind of like the daily work of survival. It feels like a particularly elite, kind of middle class, kind of African American woman narrative on the one hand, and so I don't want to put too much stock, into that. But it also happens in a time when the kind of globally facing Black women's networks that have always existed are under pressure financially, are being gutted by cuts to US aid, by cuts
Yeah,
to the kind of entire network that supports,
totally.
global funding, as problematic as it always was. as critical as as I've always been of that kind of, imperialist US money, the reality is people were able to often use that very subversively and to get things done. And so I think both the very sudden pulling of that, the kind of collapse of that, the people's need to scramble around for resources. I think all of these things have kind of played into each other in a way that leaves movements very, very difficult, dire straits at the moment,
Mm,
precisely when they are the most needed, precisely when those are the kinds of people who are able to articulate, to have the space, the time on a laptop to sit and to think and to articulate those kinds of connections, to do the culture work, but also to do the movement building work that, you
yeah,
know, that once would have been possible. And I think we're just finding ourselves completely smashed from all sides.
totally. No, no, no. I think that's wonderfully articulated. You're so, so right. It's not like we can't speak in platitudes. It really is kind of all these sort of granular little things that are the carpet is being swept from under everybody's feet very, in very peculiar and
Yeah.
violent ways. I have a final question for you, talking about silence and writers and all the people who are just media that's part, and who's writing and who's not writing and things like that. And I'm remembering one of your old, very viral essays, All Your Faves Are Problematic. So you kind of called it years ago. So and you want to say a little bit about that essay, but then I want you to tell me about, like, what do you think about this scene? What are writers? What do they stand to lose? Is this self censorship, or is censorship real? Because I'm starting to see, like, sometimes there isn't censorship, just like, right, and you may even go viral, you may even get famous, actually. So it's like, I don't know what's happening you know
I remember that essay. Gosh, I haven't thought about that for a long time, but it was in response to Chimamanda. And at the time she was like everybody's darling. Chimamanda was beloved by, a generation of African writers who was like, wow, she's made it in a particular kind of books, your books are in an airport way. But had an integrity and a lyricism to her writing that was actually quite like wow, right? So she had both critical acclaim and also, mass appeal, and then had become a spokesperson in a way for a new sort of generation of cosmopolitan African women. And so we loved her. And then, of course, she, expressed views around, trans women that were deeply problematic, completely uncalled for. And, at that time, I wrote this essay saying all your faves are problematic and that the trouble is the pedestal. And it was at the same time that Michelle Obama was like everybody's fave, right? And I think
oh
it's
god.
become very, very clear in the years since. And that was like, that essay was a long time ago. So I will give myself kudos. And yet,
No, no, you should.
for that one.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's what that was about. But I think, you're right. Again, part of, a lot of what I'm thinking about right now is this dual location, right? On the one hand, emotionally invested in South Africa, but on the other hand, materially invested elsewhere, right? So very much living in Australia in this particular colony. And one of the things about living here is observing how, you see, for all of our troubles and woes in South Africa, what happens when you live in a place where there are no resources for artists is that you just kind of have to have guerrilla tactics when you're an artist. You don't, nobody owns you.
Mm.
Very few people give you grants. If you win a grant for something, like have to wait so long before any of that money is ever seen. Like it's just the chaos gives you freedom in a sense, right? And I don't want to, sentimentalize it or make it, sound grandiose, but there is something very real about that, right? And then when you live in these places, when you live in Europe, when you live in America, when you live in Australia, in places where um, being part of the cultural scene brings with it material benefits, where you can win grants, where you get invited into certain places, where you were recognized before 3 years ago for being an outspoken voice. and that same outspoken voice can speak about anything except for Palestine, then I think it is there is a real seduction about being quiet, about not being noticed, about just waiting a little bit and then seeing if the tide is going to turn. I think it's a very attractive proposition for people. So I empathize with it because it's a larger question, right? It's a much larger structural issue, which is about how arts have become fundamentally tied to the status quo, to the establishment, to how unfunded we are, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. And there's a whole kind of conversation to be had on the question of how the craft of writing is is amplified as an individualistic activity, like the collective is being pulled away, or the writer is n- being told, look within yourself, don't think about your reader, don't think about the world around you, your pain is just within you and that's it. There's all these sort of complicated, weird, messy trends around it that has got us to this place where so many writers seem more concerned with keeping their pedestal, or they remain really bought by big publishers and big platforms and things like that, and it's depressing. My final question: what is the role of a writer in a time of genocide, especially a writer like you, who comes from a very particular place, South Africa, blackness, woman, whatever you want to, however you define yourself.
mm.
And you started this Substack, and in that Substack, you said, you called it, your kind of little line is, it's brave to be involved. So, just to unpack a little where you are with the role of the writer today.
It's such a hard question because on the one hand, of course, the role of the writer is the same as the role of the carpenter. It's the same as the role of the teacher. The role of everybody is to be at the front lines um, of fighting for justice, right? I think that um, there is a demand as a human being to show up in the world in particular ways, which is always difficult. It's difficult in all times to show up with honesty and integrity in the world. And then in a time of genocide, um, it is more important than ever. And it is also when that genocide is being carried out as it is now, um, by forces that have the power to silence you and to punish you for speaking up against that genocide. It's both more important and more difficult than ever to just be a human in this time. So I think the role of the writer is no special or no different from the role of anybody else. It's to show up and to speak the truth about what it is that you see. What was the
That's
second part of
beautiful.
the question?
No, okay, there wasn't so much a second part, but I think it's kind of, I agree with you. We are all part. Everybody should have the same role, and we should all be as involved in building our world as anybody else. As much writers, but yes, writers have disproportionate power over minds, and more people listen to them than they would to the carpenter who is not.
But we like to think so. We like to think so. But yeah, I agree. I agree. And I think that, one of the gifts of writing is the gift of time. And one of the problems of a genocide is there is no time. So I have also found it incredibly difficult to write right now. It does feel self indulgent, even as it feels urgent. It feels pointless, even though it's the only thing that I have. So I keep reading these social media posts where people are like, the point of this moment is to make you feel paralyzed. Do not allow them to make you feel paralyzed. And I think it's, absolutely correct. And it's really, really hard. Um, I don't know a single writer who's just writing
Yeah.
prolifically and just feeling great.
I
Yeah.
know. No, nobody is. And if they are doing it, they're doing it with like almost a sort of sense of as if they're rushing towards death or something. It's really hard to see some of that
Yeah.
as well. So, but yeah, yeah, no, I take it's a difficult moment, difficult time, and I don't want to lock anyone into their roles, and I want to be kind, though I usually just tend to rage. So
Yeah.
it's just like we're all
You and me,
we're all over.
you and me both. You and me both, sister. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, all right. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you again for all these wonderful things.
Thank you
Great
so much.
conversation. Worked through a lot of stuff there.
Thank you.